to see so many familiar faces here. And for all you people who've been saying, how's Buckingham course going? No longer running it. I'm retired, and it's great. I'm really, really enjoying life. Okay. On Shooter's Hill, which overlooks London to the southeast, in the grounds of a church, there's an 18th century milestone. On one face it reads 8 miles to London Bridge, another 7 miles to Dartford. The third is a memorial plate placed there in the 1920s, which reads 130 miles to Ypres. In defending the salient, our casualties were 90,000 killed, 70,000 missing, 410,000 wounded. Ypres was, in the First World War, absolutely critical ground. It was a town which, quite apart from being the last major city remained in Belgian hands at the end of 1914, it was a major communications junction. For the Allies to lose it would mean it would be a short hop and jump to the coast, to seize the Channel littoral, and it's entirely possible, had he fallen, as it came very close to, as I'm going to explain, in 1914, then the British could have been forced to Dunkirk or something very like it, 25, 30 years early. And yet, Ypres is also critical because of the myth which became associated with it, quite simply because so much blood and treasure was expended in holding Ypres in those critical battles in October, November 1914, retrospectively known as the First Battle of Ypres. It was to be succeeded by another 4 battles of Ypres, though confusingly only 3 of them were actually called the Battles of Ypres. Second Battle of Ypres, already mentioned, in April, May 1915. The Germans tried to seize the city without success. Third Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, which is fought between the end of July 1917 and the beginning of November 1917. A critical battle, of which the first battle has a bearing, which I will explain. What's effectively the 4th Battle of Ypres, though it's called the Battle of the Lys, which is the big German attack just south of Ypres and creeps up to Ypres in April 1918, and the 5th Battle of Ypres, well again it's not called that, which comes in on September the 28th, 1918, when the Allied armies march clean across the 1914-1917 battlefield in a single day. Such has been the change in warfare at that period. But it all starts in this period we're talking about here, firstly. But what I want to try to do this evening is, as well as give a picture of what actually happened, and in particular I'll be focusing on the role of Douglas Haig. I've written a biography of him, what I know most about. I'll also be trying to bring out some of the reasons why Ypres remained of such critical, mythical importance, which possibly gave it a cachet which it might otherwise deserve, and certainly made it very, very difficult for the British to think of abandoning the Ypres salient later in the war. One final point about the First Battle of Ypres before I do some background. In many ways, this can be seen as the destruction of the old British regular army. The army which went to war in August 1914 was probably man for man the best in Europe, best trained, although not the best equipped. It consisted of 40% of serving soldiers, 60% were people who were called off of the reserve, and so they had previous service but actually been back in civilian life. And this army, by the end of November 1914, was not entirely destroyed, it had taken very, very great damage. So, for example, I was reading the papers only today of an officer of a Kitchener battalion later in 1915 who says, in effect, I don't think much of the standard of the regular soldiers, because actually they're militiamen, they're people who are not really seeing proper service, they're regular battalions in name only. So that's really important. It gives a sort of sentimental attachment to thirsty among regular officers. And so also, of course, is the battle in which territorial troops, so pre-war part-time volunteers, saw action for the first time. And in doing so, they put aside many of the sort of doubts which senior officers had about them and proved that actually they were pretty good troops and they could be trained to be better. So this is very much the last gasp of the old regular army, and it actually sort of prefigures the way the army is to evolve from the end of 1914 onwards by increasing number of civilian volunteers becoming involved. To finally say it's entirely possible for someone to have been a civilian in August 1914, to have joined up and be present in the front line in the First Battle of Ypres. Won't say there's lots of them, but there's certainly some. So actually this is again is a foreshadowing of the way the army evolves. Okay, let's go back. The war begins in August 1914 with the Schlieffen Plan, or the Schlieffen-Moltke Plan as it's better known. Huge amount of controversy in academic circles about was there a Schlieffen Plan. Spoiler alert, yes there was, and the bloke who argues otherwise, I don't think he's right. There's some debate about what it actually amounted to. Well, okay, cutting through the chaff. What it amounted to was an attempt by the Germans to win the war in the West very, very swiftly, within 6 weeks. Why? Because they were aware that the Russians, who were known as the steamroller, were slow to mobilise when they begin crushing, so they thought, blow from the east. The idea is you knock out the French very, very quickly, in 6 weeks, then redeploy the German forces via strategic railways across Europe to take on the Russians advancing to the east. But in the event neither thing happens, of course, the Germans do not win in 6 weeks, and the Russians prove to be not the remorseless steamroller that people fear. In fact, I mean, the Germans do very well in the fighting on the Eastern Front in 1914. But that's nonetheless, that's what the situation is when the fighting begins. Now you can see, I hope, from this map, I mean, very busy, follow the dotted lines. The idea is a massive wheel. The original idea is that Germans are going to send their armies to encircle Paris. Simultaneously, as you can see from the blue arrows, the French launched Plan 17, which basically is an offensive into German-held territory, some of which has been French up until 1871. And the end result is neither side gets its way. The French offensive does not succeed. It takes enormously heavy casualties. In fact, the heaviest single loss of any day in the First World War is sustained by the French, I think it's on the 22nd of August in the Battle of Frontiers. But they do enough to worry Moltke the Younger, so the slightly dim nephew, unfair, not as great as Moltke the Elder. And it does enough to spook him, and basically that's one of the reasons why the Schlieffen Plan actually is curtailed. The other point worth making is that one is von Kluck's army, which is the one on the outside edge. Famously, the soldiers told to brush the channel with your sleeve as you march past. The Germans underestimate the number of troops the French can put in the field, basically because they don't think the French can create divisions out of reservists. And so they're slightly horrified when there's more French troops around than they expect. And it also means they come into contact with the British, because the British Expeditionary Force deployed to France in 1914. It's not clear it's going to happen until the very last moment. There's a big debate in Downing Street on the day after war is declared. And basically, we'll sit there and say, well, what do we do now? It's literally that sort of level of preparedness. And in order to, partly because the French don't trust the Brits, so stick them out on the flank, they can't do any harm there, which of course means that the British Expeditionary Force is in direct line as the Germans advanced. Not doing too much on this. The first battle that the British get involved in, of course, is the Battle of Mons, 23rd of August 1914. It results in the Germans basically taking a hammering, but the British are forced back through sheer weight of numbers. At this point, the BEF divides. It's basically two corps, second corps under Smith-Dorrien, first corps under Haig, and it's Smith-Dorrien's second corps who takes the bulk of the fighting, including at Lecato 3 days later on the 26th of August 1914. And thereafter, both corps are basically in free fall, marching to get out of the way, and they succeed in doing it. Now, I've just finished writing something for my forthcoming book. Don't rush out and order it on Amazon, it's not finished yet. But I've actually done a comparison of the Dunkirk campaign in 1940 with the Mons campaign in 1914. What came very, very clear to me is the difference, one of the major differences is air power. That if in 1914 the British had been pummeled from the air in the same way as their successors in 1940 had been attacked by the Luftwaffe, it could well have been a completely different story. But as it was, the BEF gets away intact. Very long story short, the Allies halt, regroup, counterattack, and the British end up fighting on the River Aisne in October 1914. This is a battle that's almost completely erased from the British popular memory. Actually, it's where trench warfare begins for the British, on the 15th, 16th of September 1914. Probably the reason why it's been erased from our memory is because it's overshadowed by what is to come, which is Ypres. The British are keen to deploy closer to the coast for good reasons of lines of communications. Also, the French think the Brits like to have the Royal Navy at their back just in case. There is a touch of that, actually. There's a friend of mine, former colleague from the Staff College, who was on British staff in Bosnia in the 1990s, and he was on a multinational planning staff. And they had a retreat route back to the coast, just in case everything went horribly wrong. Guess what the French called it? Route Dunkirk. Okay, so what happens is that the British are basically taken out of the fighting on the Aisne, very bloody, and Britain's first experience of trench warfare, and sent north. And once they have done this, things start to change. Now, this is part of what has erroneously become known as the race to the sea. What happens basically in 1914 is that as armies smack into each other, they discover the magic secret. If you dig in, if you put up a strand of barbed wire, soldiers in trenches actually can hold off larger numbers of attackers simply by being on the defensive. And rather than carry on pummeling and trying to break through, the armies then pivoted to the north to try and get round them. But of course, every time they did that, the other side would just dig in. And so in the end, you have these trench systems snaking their way up to the coast. So it's not a race to the sea. Once they've reached the sea, the war of manoeuvres failed. But nonetheless, that is what it has been known. So you've got some sense of what's going on this map here. And in the process of this last spasm of sort of old-style war, if I could put it that way, halfway between old-style warfare and new-style warfare, you get some very strange mixtures of war that Wellington would have recognised, together with very, very modern stuff. Anybody recognise this young soldier? Montgomery, that's right. Lieutenant B.L. Montgomery of the Warwicks. On the 13th of August, the 1st Warwicks is one of the battalions that's sent into battle at Meteren, which is a town some way to the south of Ypres in France. And he got involved in the fighting, his company was sent up to attack a group of buildings on the outskirts of Ypres. And being a man, a soldier of his age, he led with a drawn sword. And his memoirs, he wrote how he taught him how to kill a German with a sword. And so when he found a large Hun pointing a rifle with him, he kicked him in what he described as a tender spot in the lower part of the stomach, and claimed this was the first example that he had come across of the use of surprise in warfare. Now, Monty took the German prisoner. He makes a sort of joke of it in his memoirs, but I think it's actually quite a significant, as in symbolic moment. He's later shot through the chest, and that's basically the reason that he survives 1914 and 1915. He's sent home to recuperate. When he comes out, he's basically a staff officer and a commander. But this is this sort of juxtaposition of leading with the sword à la Waterloo, with a sort of very different warfare that's become Montgomery's forte in the Second World War. He's someone famous who survives, but you can see all of these sorts of things are going on all the time. I could cite numerous examples of this sort of action. Okay, Haig finally leaves the River Ain on the 16th of October, and he arrives at Saint-Omer on the 16th of October at about 5:30. Now, what's happening now is what is known as the Battle of La Bassée, which is the battle before and slightly to the south of the Battle of Ypres. I should, of course, actually point out to the ordinary British soldier, this is all completely, this is irrelevant. It's just one horrible mess that's going on day after day, week after week, week after week. It's only historians and sort of people like me who say, oh, this is La Bassée, this is Ypres. Sir John French, who is the commander of the British Expeditionary Force at this stage, gives Haig, First Corps commander, very, very ambitious orders to attack what he believes are light German forces south of Ypres. So basically in this area here. So La Bassée battle is being fought to the south here. Now, the BEF has already taken a big kicking. It's very confused encounter battles. I've actually taken some battlefield tours to the ground, and it's more than usually confusing, put it that way, because a small patrol might come forward and take a farmhouse, only be kicked out by an attacking enemy company, and so on and so forth. It gives a sense of the fact that the warfare is still quite fluid at this stage. This is not yet congealed into trench warfare. Now, Haig is wary of French's optimism. French wants Haig to push the Germans back. And 2nd Division reaches an obscure village, which is to the east of Ypres, by the name of Passchendaele. And this is the British Army's first taste of Passchendaele. And Haig describes it as being quite a serious combat, which came to bayonet work. Coming under pressure from German attacks from different angles brings the troops back. Now, a point to make here is that the fighting at Passchendaele in October 1914, it seems quite stiff. It's a mere skirmish compared to what is going to be conducted over exactly the same ground 3 years later. So people are really quite shocked at the volume of artillery, how many people are being killed by modern weapons. The British Army basically has its supply of artillery ammunition calculated on the basis of that used in the Second World War, 1899 to 1902. And then the British Army turns up with so many shells, basically the entire lot is shot off within a month. So this is an incredibly material-heavy form of fighting, and casualties are on a much greater scale than anybody on either side of the line has anticipated. what actually happens at the end of it? Well, by the end of the Battle of La Bassée, the Germans have actually recognised that Ypres itself, so down here, is in a vulnerable position, and actually with sufficient forces it may be possible to break through and seize it. Now, given that Ypres is a key communications junction, it's got a railway, roads and a canal, to grab that actually really would have been to put their hands round the Allied windpipe. So it's actually very, very serious matter to defend it. And the result of this is the Germans bring in some newly raised formations, some of which become famous as the student divisions, and they make a concerted effort for 3 weeks or so in October and November 1914 to smash their way through the enemy positions. Let's look at the first one in a bit of detail. I found this map on the internet. It's not. I think that they got the date wrong. And this chap here is not sure who he is anyway. But anyway, it gives the general impression. What we have here is German 4th Army and German 6th Army massing against the British Expeditionary Force, basically the 1st Corps under Haig and the Cavalry Corps under Allenby. So, 2 British Corps against an army? Not really. Cavalry Corps is much smaller than an infantry corps, because if you think of it, that each cavalry regiment basically can only deploy about 1/3 as many dismounted infantrymen as an infantry regiment, infantry battalion I should say. So if you're going to use a cavalry regiment in a dismounted role, which of course they are very largely doing at this stage, you need to tell off a certain number of horsemen to hold the horses of the others. It's normally 1 horse holder to every 4 horses. And in any case, cavalry regiments are a lot weaker. So basically the cavalry corps equates to maybe an infantry division in terms of strength. So it's not, so the term there is pretty misleading. And as you can see, the Germans mass a huge amount of combat power against the British positions. I need to say that this is not just a British battle. The French are in there to the south and to the north, and indeed some Belgians, but I'm going to be concentrating on the British perspective in my talk this afternoon. Now, this battle is particularly significant in the evolution of the command of this individual. I actually couldn't find Haig as a corps commander. He's actually taken a bit later, but that's who the man is. Now, Sir James Edmonds, who's the British official historian, he writes privately after the war that firstly is the making of Haig's reputation. And I think he's absolutely right. Haig has become, for all sorts of obvious reasons, famous as an attacking general, for good reasons, in a good way or not, depending on your point of view. But actually, he was, I think, quintessentially a defensive general, and I think firstly proved how good he was at that. And certainly, the devolved nature of command in the BEF meant that French, in effect, said to Haig, his responsibility for holding Ypres, carry on with it. And so this is very, very much Haig's battle, and he's the man whose decisions will win or potentially lose the battle. Saving the BEF, as Edmonds put it, was down to Haig. Well, the first crisis began on the 29th of October, and it built to a crescendo of danger 2 days later. Falkenhayn, who by this stage has replaced Moltke as the overall German commander, assembled Army Group von Farbeck, reinforced with sufficient guns and divisions to give it a 2-to-1 advantage at the point of the attack. And as you can see, Army Group Farbeck's main blow was against First Corps and against Allenby's dismounted cavalrymen, plus a few Indians, plus a few territorials further to the south. And the German attacks of the 29th of October succeed in capturing Gellivelt Crossroads here. Absolute critical place which we will return to in a few minutes. Now, Gellivelt village stands on a small bump in the ground, and you can sort of stand near it and not realise it's on the high ground at all. But of course, in a war dominated by artillery, which the First World War is, a few feet of height can give superior observation, which could be critical. Basically, can you see into the enemy's positions? If you've got a bit of high ground, perhaps you can. And so Gellivelt Plateau becomes absolutely critical point for the fighting. And what Haig is doing at this stage is what's described as puttying up. In other words, as the Germans are making a lodgement into the British positions, he's sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, he's taking units, he's shoving them into the front line, he's just about holding on. But he's well aware, actually, you can't do that forever, and you need, as a commander, to maintain a reserve under your own hand at the crucial point, either to throw back a major enemy advance, or indeed to seize the initiative and to attack yourself. Haig would recognise this, but he was desperately short of reserve units, and those he had were under strength and they were exhausted. To be fair, the Germans were exhausted too, but we've got to bear in mind that this battle has been fought not by people like us in a sort of peak of physical health. It's actually been fought through a fog of fatigue, of sheer exhaustion. Sometimes people just didn't almost literally know what day of the week it was. And I think that one of the things you can see about this is some units actually, contrary to recent experience, deployed themselves on a forward slope. In other words, in full view of the enemy rather than falling back behind that. Now that's either people being militarily dense. I suspect people are so weary that they just don't think through their situation. Well, okay, so Haig is sort of clinging on by his fingertips, he's well aware of that. Then a message arrives from Sir John French, which says, Dear Douglas, I'm not quoting verbatim, attack the next day and achieve a, quote, decisive result. Yeah, you can just imagine what Haig's reputation was. Haig said, yeah, very well, fine boss. When I taught at Sandhurst, I got to know about this extremely useful phrase called consent and evade. Come across that? Brilliant idea, sir. And that's basically what Haig did. He basically said, absolutely, and then gave orders for them to dig in and not to attack. The 30th of October saw more putting up, basically using units which should have been used to carry the fight to the enemy, to shore up the line which is bending ominously under the weight of the German attack. But then on Saturday, the 31st of October 1914, Halloween, the German army came closer to defeating the BEF than at any other time in the war. Now, I don't know if anybody's had the misfortune of reading the British official histories of the First World War. They're not exactly a rip-roaring read. They tend to wear very sort of measured, calm prose. So when a passage like this is written, you know this was really serious. And don't forget that Edmunds himself was present on the Western Front at this time. Writing about Halloween 1914, he wrote, a decisive German victory seemed assured, for everything pointed to the British being completely exhausted. And they may well have appeared so to the enemy. The line that stood between the British Empire and ruin was composed of tired, haggard and unshaven men, unwashed, plastered with mud, many in little more than rags. Now that's pretty spectacular by Edmund standards, but of course he's absolutely right. The first act of the Halloween attack was a German assault in the Gellivelt area just after 6 a.m.
Weren't the Germans in the same position?
Yes. No, not entirely. They got fresh troops. If anyone's got any questions, I'm very happy to take them afterwards. Yeah, where was I? The attack goes in at the Gellivelt sector about 6 a.m. And this occasion, 1st Division succeeded in throwing back most of the attackers, but the Germans built on this, and the pressure built up throughout the day. And further south, along the Messines Ridge, the cavalry corps came under increasing pressure. And on the previous day, Haig had committed the 1st 14th Londons, the London Scottish, to mention it being this particular building, from 1st Corps Reserve to Cavalry Corps, and they're thrown into battle on the 31st of October. They become the first territorial unit to see action, not the first on the Western Front. And it's a really spectacular attack, not least because they are armed with older patterns of Lee Enfield rifles, some of which are unable to do rapid fire. In other words, it basically becomes a single shot weapon. And these guys had mostly been clerks, bank managers, people like that before the war. Being in the territorials, particularly a smart territorial regiment like London Scottish, was a very good thing to do. Plenty of sport, all that rest of it, but they found themselves doing some really testing fighting. They were thrown into battle. Actually, they succeeded in pushing the Germans back. In the scheme of things, didn't make too much difference, but it was headline material, because the territorials for the first time had actually gone into battle and shown they could basically take it. Now, quite often I've taken parties to Messines Ridge. You can stand where they attack us. There's a Celtic cross, and fascinatingly, you can stand on that ground and you can talk about the attack of the London Scottish in 1914, and then you could, without changing position at all, you can talk about the attack of the 36th Ulster Division on exactly the same ground in 1917. Well, to make the point again and again, these are the first battles over this area. They are not the last ones. Also, I could talk about this. I had a question if anyone's interested, but it's fascinating to look at sophisticated tactics being used in June 1917 compared with the basically charge firing from the hip approach of October 1914. You really see a massive change in the way that war is being conducted. But in spite of everybody's heroics, the cavalry are forced off of Messines Ridge, and it's not until June 1917 that the Allies finally retake it. What actually happens up at Gellivelt, up here, is even more serious. After the early morning push for about 2 hours, from 8 a.m, the British infantry of 1st Division are being absolutely thumped by German artillery. Now, when we think of trenches, we probably think of 1916, quite deep, welted up things. 1914, not to be very much more than scrapes in the ground. Maybe some shell holes which are sort of joined together, but these are very rudimentary. Even by the undemanding standards of October 1914, the trenches that the 1st Division are holding in this sector are really primitive. And by 11:30, Gellivelt village has been attacked, and the Germans captured it entirely at 1 p.m. Now, the loss of Gellivelt village signals far more than simply a terrain feature changing hands. It signals the collapse of British defences on the main axis of the German advance. In other words, it's the crisis of the battle. And General Lomax, who's the commander of the 1st Division, faced up reality when at 12:45 he stated that, "My line is broken." And if the situation appeared to black, it was about to get even worse. On the 29th of October, Haig had vacated Hooge Chateau. Again, if anybody's been to the Ypres area, you'll know where Hooge Chateau is. It's opposite the big cemetery and not far from Belgium's biggest theme park, very sensitively put on a 1914 battlefield. And first Division Air Headquarters moves into Hooge Chateau. Now, for Haig to get out to the big and obvious target is a sensible thing to do. For not one but two divisional headquarters then to move into it, not so much. And at 1:15, the inevitable happened. It's hit by German shells. Monroe, the commander of 2nd Division, is very badly shaken up. Revived, I was pleased to find out at Haig's headquarters by slurping from Haig's own brandy flask. But Lomax, the commander of 1st Division, is fatally wounded. Horrible story. He actually lingers until, I think, May 1915 in a really awful condition. Point is that at precisely the moment of fighting, you don't want this to happen. A key link has been taken out of the British command chain. Both divisional headquarters are in effect out of action for the foreseeable future. Haig is in his headquarters about 4 miles behind the front lines, and he is suffering from the typical frustration of a First World War commander. What I mean by this is that he's not really clear what's going on in front of him. He's receiving only fragmentary bits of information that's coming forward. And unlike Wellington at Waterloo or Lee at Gettysburg, 40 odd years before, he can't simply get on his horse and ride up and down and see what's going on, because the battle's become too big and the armies are too dispersed. It's often said, well, why didn't Haig command closer to the front line? Well, he could have done that, but in the process he demoted himself from commander of an army to basically lance corporal, because the only people he could have commanded were the ones that he physically could shout at. So in a war which lacks radio communications, as per Monty, or for that matter, battles which are small and compact enough for you to ride around and give orders in person, First World War commanders, they really can't do very much at all to influence the outcome of battles. So, when his Chief of Staff, Johnny Goff, arrives to tell him of the fate of 1st Division, Haig, in a rather understated way, wrote in his diary, this was rather a shock. There it was. Then French, Sir John French turned up to explain what's going on. And there's been a number of historians over the years who have claimed that Haig lost his nerve, that basically he ordered his divisions to pull back. In fact, there's even been a sort of rather bizarre conspiracy theory that he actually, he then sort of had it covered up after the war, to disguise the fact he lost his nerve. Well, he didn't. I mean, I think he did on one occasion earlier in the campaign, but he didn't hear. And John Hussey, historian, has actually done a very, very careful analysis of the evidence, and I think he's actually right to say that Haig is clearly very concerned, but he doesn't panic. Apparently, the one giveaway of his concerns is constantly tugging at his moustache. When he was doing that, you knew the boss was having a moment. The truth is rather more mundane. Haig had prudently and entirely properly taken some preliminary steps to plan to extricate his corps if everything went for a ball. So on the 29th of October, he sent his command of Royal Engineers, Brigadier General Rice, to examine the routes across the canal that ran near Ypres, and Rice had identified 2 possible intermediate positions you could then fall back if you had to disengage. Well, when it became clear that 1st Division's front had been broken, Haig opted to fall back to the first of Rice's alternative positions, and the order went down about 1:30. Now, this is actually a very dangerous manoeuvre, because it could be that by ordering your frontline troops to disengage, pull back, they lose what little cohesion they have left. In fact, I think Haig is placing a good deal of trust, I think he was right to do so, in the quality of his infantry. That actually was not a collapsing. That actually, by disengaging, falling back, it would actually allow them to buy some time to catch their breath. Well, Field Marshal French turned up at 1 Corps headquarters about 2 p.m. But he really couldn't do anything more than offer, sort of moral support and sympathy. French then left, and then Brigadier Rice, so his head sapper, turned up, described as being red-faced and puffing. The dramatic news that the 2nd Worcesters had retaken Gallivelt and restored the situation, at least for the moment. And Haig was characteristically sceptical at this news. He basically operated on the basis that no news was ever as good or as bad as it first appeared. Haig said he hoped it wasn't another false report and decided to ride to the front to find out what happened. Now, Haig's ride has been a matter of controversy among historians, with disputes about its timing, whether it was a PR stunt, or whether someone has even claimed it didn't happen at all. A rather more sensible criticism is whether Haig was right to leave his headquarters at that particular moment, when things were up in the air. And one historian has said that anxiety certainly clouded Haig's judgment. I just don't agree with that. In his diary, Haig gave a straightforward and entirely believable motive for his ride. I got on my horse and rode forward to see if I could do anything to organise stragglers and push them forward to check the enemy. Now, this is the instinct of an old regimental officer to go forward and lead. One of the besetting sins of British senior officers in the First World War is that many of them were overgrown regimental commanders, and that's what they wanted to be. They wanted to be up with the chaps. Famously, more British divisional commanders were killed on a single day, 25th of September 1915, first day of the Battle of Loos, than were killed in the entire Second World War. But basically, they weren't doing their jobs. Leading blokes from the front is not the job of the divisional commander. But I don't think we should criticise Haig for that, because actually there was more to it than that. Rice himself gave some evidence which said that Haig and his staff went forward beyond Hughes Chateau to see where we established a sort of advanced headquarters. Now, this makes perfect sense. Haig was not going on a joy ride, nor did he go to the front line just to stiffen the morale of whatever soldiers happened to see him. He went forward as a corps commander to assess the situation for himself, to speak to the commanders on the spot, Capper of 7th Division, Byng of 3rd Cavalry Division, Landon, who had taken over command of 1st Division, Fitzclarence of 1st Guards Brigade, Monroe of 2nd Division. And later he spoke to General Moussy, who was the French commander on his flank. As a result of these consultations, Haig ordered some redeployment of troops, in part to create a reserve and gain a clear picture of the state of his forces. But it was not reassuring. He wrote in his diary, "Troops very exhausted. The 2 brigadiers assure me if the enemy makes a push at any point, they doubt our men being able to hold on. Fighting by day and digging to strengthen the trenches by night has thoroughly turned them out." Yet the British line held, and largely I think is this that the Germans just didn't launch that attack. I think because they were so shocked and they had taken such losses from the attacking the British that they were in no state to take advantage of the British the British problems. Let me just say a little bit more about the famous attack of the Worcesters. No, can you wait till afterwards, please?
The gunners.
Can I just finish my talk and...
The gunners.
No, sorry, can you hold your question
Okay.
afterwards, we talk then. The 2nd Worcesters, under the command of Major Hankey, the Lieutenant Colonel was a casualty by the stage, had 4 companies to play with. He left 1 to defend the Menin Road. He had B Company Reserve, C and D Company. He took straight down the road towards Gallivelt, and basically he formed the men up and had them advance in a loose skirmish line, and succeeded with only 370 men. You know, a battalion at full strength is 1,000. So it's already massively under strength. They take 100 casualties en route, but their timing is absolutely impeccable. They fight their way up the road. They get into the village. At the point at which the Germans are quite wobbly, they push them back, and then they're able to consolidate and hold on to the ground. They're then pulled back about 600 yards a few hours later, and they dig in. But the point is they've actually broken the impetus of the German advance just at the moment when, you know, the British line looked extremely wobbly. Okay, well, the British have survived at First Ypres, the first crisis of the battle, but there's another one. That comes, oh sorry, that's Gallivelt, yeah, rather fanciful picture. The next one comes at Nonnenboschen on the 11th of November 1940. Nonnenboschen means Nuns Wood. Today, if you go there, it's either side of the horrible motorway that's been built in the last 25 years. Now the troops here, the British troops anyway, they're from the 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, of which I, at one point, maybe I still am, was the president, honorary president of the Old Comrades Association. Now, really, really important regiment this, the 52nd Regiment of Foot. They, according to the regimental history, have won 3 major battles. They single-handedly, so I believe, won the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 by repulsing the French Guard. They single-handedly won D-Day, 6th of June 1944, by capturing Pegasus Bridge. And in between times, they single-handedly won the First Battle of Ypres by capturing Nonnenboschen. I exaggerate only slightly. Right, what happened? The Germans succeed after 10 or so days of bringing up reserves, gathering their breath from the hammering that they have taken so far, to be in a position to attack over again. And this time, they again almost break through. The attack is, ironically enough, on the 11th of November. Like the Halloween attack, this came perilously close to success. And the situation was saved by a counterattack in which the 52nd, the 2nd Ox and Bucks, not the Ox and Bucks, it's the Ox and Bucks, that is very important apparently. Again, it's the action of a single unit which arrived at the right time and hits the enemy when they're just off balance. They weren't the only people involved, but nonetheless, they're the ones who delivered the key blow. Let's just have a quick read from Haig's diary for the 11th of November 1914. The situation was extremely critical. Most of the divisional and corps reserves had been used to re-establish the position in the vicinity of the Menin Road, and the lack of the 5 battalions which had been drawn from General Vidal, the French had given the battalions, taken them back, was now very severely felt. At 3 p.m, Colonel Davis with the Ox and Bucks, Dougie got it wrong, advances southeast from West Hook and clears the Nonnenboschen wood with the bayonets. The Irish and Grenadier Guards support. The Germans are driven back with heavy loss, and the Oxford reach the old trenches near Polygon Wood. But owing to French guns shelling the ground, our troops cannot occupy the old line as far as the Menin Road. Many prisoners of the German Guard Division are taken. They say that they had been especially brought up from Arras to break our line because the other army corps had failed to do so. Our losses are heavy. The 1st Brigade is reported to have no formed body left. Story is told of German officer who is taken prisoner. He's led back to the rear areas and passes through the British gun lines. And he says, well, where's your infantry defence? And say, they're up there. They had come that close to breaking the infantry and reaching the gun lines. If they had done that, I think that would have been the end for the BEF at Ypres. Let me just have a few concluding remarks. The Germans and the British are basically fought out by the end of the fighting on the 11th of November, certainly by 12th, 13th of November, that's it. Both sides are exhausted. They dig in, and so this bold, salient shape, this actually becomes the ground that is held by the army into 1915. It becomes the Ypres salient. Salient, of course, being a military position that's surrounded on three sides by the enemy. It becomes a critical part of the strategy for the Western Front for this point onwards. The British could easily have been beaten. If it had not been for German exhaustion, I think the sheer bloody-mindedness of the British troops and the fact that Haig, I think, was very well served by his lesser commanders. So people like Colonel Davis of the Ox and Bucks, or for that matter, Brigadier General Fitzclarence, won the Victoria Cross in the British War, Irish Guardsman, Commander, 1st Guards Brigade, became known as GOC, General Officer Commanding Menin Road. He was the sort of dynamic character who was going up and down the road at any time, you know, trying to impose his personality onto groups, to get people together, to get them to fight effectively. He's actually killed during the first battle of Ypres. So it's certainly not a one-man band in terms of Haig saving the moment. It's an army which actually, I think, is rescued from its many deficiencies by the quality of its leadership at all levels. From the, I exclude Sir John French from that, but starting at corps level, I think Haig does well as corps commander. His divisional commanders do well. Brigadiers, regimental commanders, right down to sergeants and corporals, or sometimes literally kicking their men into position to get them awake, get them to face the next attack. That, I think, more than anything else, sees the British through. Two final points. Firstly, as I said at the beginning, this is the making of Haig's reputation. He emerges from First Ypres very clearly as the coming man, that actually if Sir John French happens to fall under a bus, he's probably going to take over. Actually, in seniority terms, Smith-Dorrien will probably get the nod, but the army's choice would be Haig. Smith-Dorrien, of course, is removed by French in the spring of 1915, and so Haig then becomes, not merely the crowner, the heir apparent, but the actual heir. And Haig's resilience, his calm decision-making is recognised at all levels of the army. Even those people who don't like him very much actually think, he's done pretty well. All of this, of course, means that he gets quite a lot of brownie points in the plus column, if you like, for when he takes over as Commander-in-Chief at the end of 1915 and sees him through some pretty turbulent times, 1916 and 1917. The final thing is that First Ypres, I think, does have a really important impact on the way that both armies think about the war. Looking first of all at the Germans, they are really surprised they don't succeed in breaking through the British positions. They start to have to rethink their basically having written off the British. The British are still actually on a much smaller scale deployed than the French, but clearly they put up a massive fight. And the Germans under Falkenhayn in 1915 basically go onto the defensive in the West. They start to come up with a strategy, broadly speaking, of attacking in the East and also unleashing unrestricted submarine warfare. Neither strategies succeed entirely, but nonetheless, it's probably the best the Germans could have done in 1915. And I think First Ypres is a factor in why Falkenhayn makes that decision. The other big impact, I think, is on Haig himself. When he's fighting over the same ground in the autumn of 1917, he, on at least one occasion, refers to the Germans' failure to carry on attacking during First Ypres when the Brits were on their uppers. In fact, at one stage he even gets his 1914 diary sent out from home so he can read them and remind himself of what's going on. And so, in the later stage of the Passchendaele offensive, when Haig is battering away, partly the reason for that is he believes that actually if you break off fighting now, you might be throwing away the golden opportunity to break through, as he believed the Germans had done in the First Battle of Ypres. So for all sorts of reasons, not just the Germans are stopped in their tracks in October, November 1914, the First Battle of Ypres is a really consequential battle of the First World War. Relatively small scale in comparison to what is to come later, but it has massive implications. Thank you very much. I'm now open to questions.
What role did the gunners play in the battle, and what guns did we have?
Well, basically they were using the usual 18-pounders, 4.5-inch howitzers. I don't think there's anything much bigger than that at this stage. They were doing in comparison to what the gunners were doing later, their stuff was very primitive. They were only just got beyond the idea of pushing the guns right up to support the infantry. They'd done that as late as Locato on the 26th of August 1914, and they came perilously close to firing over open sights. But it's basically direct support of the infantry is the most important role. The heavy artillery core assets, of which there's a few howitzers and things, they're sort of lobbing into the distance. But essentially, this is the 18-pounder and the 4.5 howitzer. Now, artillery is, I think, the single most important weapon the British have to deploy later in the war. It isn't in 1914. It's a bit more than a nice to have, but it has not yet achieved that critical role that it does within a few months. Everybody's still learning how to use your weapons properly.
The Germans had guns though, didn't they?
The Germans had lots of guns, yeah.
Yeah.
And the sheer scale of the German artillery was really shocking because, of course, the Germans, unlike the British, had actually built up a siege train before the war. So they had much larger numbers of heavy guns intended for use against modern fortresses, which of course came in very, very handy using against trenches. But even then, the German gunnery is not nearly as efficient as it becomes later in the war.
And there's a point, I think, quite early in the war, where the German commander tells his government the war cannot be won. Is it at the point where he fails to break through and capture Ypres?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure which one you're referring to. Moltke the younger, Moltke the dimmer, he actually has in effect a nervous breakdown, and so he's gradually he's sacked, but it's not announced as being a sacking because it would have demoralised the troops, what have you. But he's sidelined from I think mid-September onwards, and replaced by Falkenhayn. Now, Falkenhayn doesn't say what you just said in quite such blunt terms, but he recognises very clearly, and one of the few people to do so on the German side, that actually, if you fail to win quickly, you'll get locked into a war of attrition. That is not a war in the long term Germany can win, because the French Empire and the British Empire combined have a vast amount of resources that simply can overwhelm the Germans if you give them time to deploy them. And of course, he's absolutely right about that. So his decision, and he doesn't have a completely free hand in this. He's in effect the commander-in-chief of the German army, but the real commander-in-chief of the German army is the Kaiser, who has an irritating habit of actually remembering every now and again he's commander-in-chief of the German army and behaving in that way. Falkenhayn, as I said, his decision is basically to attack in the east, which is very successful. He launches a series of offensives which conquers most of what's modern-day Poland, drives the Germans back. He launches the second Battle of Ypres as a sort of spoiler attack, which is not terribly well handled. But basically, whereas the Allies capture almost no ground in the west, Germany capture a very large amount of ground on the Eastern Front, which actually has a quite significant impact on Russia's ability to fight. Russia goes on for another 2 years, but what happens in 1915 is really quite serious. There's a big debate, but one theory is that the reason why Falkenhayn launches the Battle of Verdun in February 1916, sorry, there's a debate between historians, is that he recognises that the Allies are going to win in the long-term war of attrition. So therefore you suck them into fighting in such a way that the French lose such vast numbers of men that they will come to the table and they will negotiate a settlement. It's not a complete victory for the Germans, but it'd be on favourable terms. It all goes horribly wrong, but according to one theory, that's the idea behind it. So Falkenhayn actually is not a very attractive character. I mean, German generals rarely are, but he's got his head screwed on. He actually can read the tea leaves pretty clearly that, you know, resources of the German Empire, resources of the Allies, you know, the two, in the end, there can only be one result. And so he tries one of the very few generals who's prepared to achieve something less than complete victory. And dare I say it, had German High Command listened to what he said, things might have got a bit better for them in the First World War than they actually did. Yeah.
Harry, two questions. One is, you didn't say what were the numbers of troops on either side, the Allies and the Germans. And the second element was, so you've got rifles that are accurate at 1,000 yards. You've got open territory most of the time. Is this not just a complete bloodbath? You fire and accuracy at 1,000 yards. How did anyone get close and do bayonet charges and the rest of it?
Okay, well, it's actually quite difficult to come up with numbers because, you know, each division in theory on British side is 16,000 strong or thereabouts. It's below half strength or something by that stage and gets lower. But with the Germans outnumber the British by about 2 to 1, probably more than that in reality, because the Germans are able to bring up some fresh formations. Well, and actually, when it comes to tactics, you put your finger on one of the main problems, that actually military theorists, and not just theorists, you know, people who are sort of looking at modern warfare in the run-up to 1914, they're not stupid. They look at things like the Boer War, they look at things like the Russo-Japanese War, which I'm sure you all know, has a sort of proto-First World War style land campaign fought in Manchuria, 1904, 1905. And all the news coming out of this is losses are horrendous. But the second part is, if, however, you stick to your guns, the side with the better morale will ultimately prevail. Now that's the lessons that come out of the Japanese fighting against the Russians. Japanese lost very, very heavily, but in the end, Japanese morale was intact, Russian morale collapsed, therefore the Russians were defeated. Now, generals on both sides, France, Britain, Germany, are well aware of all this in 1914, and if you said to any of them candidly, do you really think you can win without taking enormous losses, they probably would have said, no, I don't think you can. But they were in a position, they were put in a job to do a job, and if that meant them going out and fighting a land war, they had to find the best way of doing it. And what they did was try to maximise firepower while linking that to the shattering of enemy morale. Now there's been all sorts of studies in recent years which shows that actually, if you're on the wrong end of a bayonet charge, it's really, really not good news. Very rarely, if an army is being charged by a determined enemy with fixed bayonets, they end up skewering them. Very, very few examples in history of basically fencing with bayonets on either side. Just the sight of cold steel coming against you when you've already got a rather wobbly morale, which has been blasted by artillery fire, that can be enough to set you off. And so that's what bayonet fighting is really all about. And on both sides, the Germans and the British, there are still enough determined men who, in spite of everything, can come to grips and actually get involved in close quarter fighting. Now, I don't want anybody to think for one moment I'm saying Only the Germans ran away when faced by bayonets. The British did it too. And so even in this terribly bloody battle dominated by firepower, there remained a role for close quarter combat. It might not actually come to physically trading blows, but getting close enough was enough to make people's morale crack and they will run away. And that actually is true for the rest of the First World War, indeed for the Second World War, I would argue, up to the present time. But in 1914, they're really only getting to grips with this. It's still, both sides are amazed and horrified by how bloody the fighting is. And later on in the war, they have rather more sensible tactics, which are much more conserving casualties and all that. But at the moment, they're just desperately fighting either to break through or to hold on to their trenches. And it's fighting at its most visceral and bloody. And, you know, never been in a battle, thank goodness, but I imagine one battle to avoid being in would be this one, if you possibly could. I always fancied the idea of being the range officer on Ben Becula in the First World War, strike as being a suitably useful but safe occupation. Yeah.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about supplying at this stage, because obviously it's very early in the war, and I mean, how efficient were the supply lines and how was it working then? And it had been a war of movement really until this point.
Well, I talk mainly about the British because that's what I know about. Surprisingly good, actually. The British Army had underwent a massive period of reform and reorganisation for the end of the Boer War. Beginning of the Boer War, almost everything involved with the British Army didn't work properly. It's an exaggeration, but nonetheless, it's one there's a certain amount of truth in it. And among the many things that had actually reformed in the Edwardian period are supplies. And so in 1914, the supply system is pretty efficient. Even on the retreat from Mons, they're able to dump supplies of food so soldiers could get it and what have you. And one of the good things about the fight around Ypres, from a logistician's point of view, is that the front is pretty stable. So you know where your base is, you know where you want to get your stuff to. It's not necessarily straightforward getting it there because you're under shell fire and the rest of it, but actually it's a lot easier than trying to find a column of troops on the march. And so what some of the unsung heroes of the First Battle of Ypres are the drivers of the Army Service Corps and what have you, who are, I mean, literally driving, as in horse wagons, up to the front line, offloading food, offloading supplies, going back and picking the stuff up. And this is unglamorous work. It's very dangerous work under fire, but unless the system keeps on going. Having said that, they're now getting running critically short of ammunition at various times, and so you get the classic thing of going out and going through the pouches of the dead and wounded and collecting bullets and so on. So it's not perfect, but actually the supply system works better than you might have thought. On the German side, it's also a pretty efficient system. Again, the main thing is the sheer distance they're travelling, because whereas the British are pretty close to Allied supply ports at this stage of the war, the Germans have to bring their stuff a long way from their depots in Germany itself, and so inevitably there's a bit of lag, stuff getting forward. But you know, trench warfare, which is what this becomes, is from the logistician's point of view, you know, nice, that's what we like. The thing they really hate is a very, very mobile war like the war in the Western Desert between 1941 and 42. People nipping all over the place. Logistician's nightmare. Yeah.
You've spoken about the style of leadership of senior commanders, of exposing themselves to sort of enemy fire, close up with their men. Did that style, was it reassessed after that particular battle during the rest of the First World War, or did it wait till the interwar years?
No, it's been reassessed while the war's going on. Now, the way it's being described, and I agree with this, is there's the sort of what I've been talking about here is the officer as warrior style, which is very much leading from the front, waving the sword, going forward, all the rest of it. And that becomes recognised as being inappropriate above a certain level for command on the Western Front. What you really need is a war manager. Now, this man, did anybody mention a very good book has been written about him? Available on Amazon for excellent Christmas presents. Anyway, Haig is a very good example of someone who's both, because it's very clear from his ride to the front at First Ypres that he has the instincts of a frontline regimental commander. But equally, he recognises once he reaches this role, Commander-in-Chief of the BEF, that's really not what he's paid to do. And he is, if like, the quintessential war manager who sits behind a desk, drafts orders, deals with paperwork, has to delegate his commands to subordinate commanders, which is one of the reasons why his reputation is so awful, because that's not what people want to hear that generals are doing. But actually, that is what a general should do. The best ones in all wars were ones who managed to be war managers while maintaining the appearance of being a frontline commander. So, for example, I mean, Bill Slim, who actually is one of my favourite commanders of the lot, you know, he was a highly effective modern general, as in, you know, he knew how to manage a conflict. And what was his public image? He would wander around with a carbine over his shoulder, you know, Uncle Bill, the frontline soldier. Well, yes, he was, from a PR point of view, but actually he was really a war manager. And you see the struggle between the warrior and the manager types throughout the First World War, and generally speaking, the successful First World War commanders are the ones who recognise what you need to be as a manager. So French, who is so Sir John French, who is very much a warrior, is replaced by Haig, who is much more of a manager. Falkenhayn, who is a manager, replaces Moltke, who's not much of a leader either, but you know, you gradually see this new sort of commander emerge, and they're the ones who, in effect, you know, take command in both World Wars. Yeah.
You mentioned Horace Smith-Dorrien
Yes.
3 times. You mentioned him in the context of a rival. You mentioned him as commanding the Second Corps, and you mentioned his dismissal in 1915. My understanding is that he did a great deal to save, before we reached this point, to save the BEF. I'd just like you to say a little bit about why he got the hoof.
Oh, well, the first bit, you're absolutely right. I mean, as commander of Second Corps, it was his corps which took the burden of the attack, the German attack at Mons, and then at Le Cateau. Haig's corps was present at Mons, but didn't do very much fighting, and from that point onwards, Second Corps went that way, First Corps went the other way, for all sorts of mostly good reasons. And Smith-Dorrien fought Le Cateau basically because he realised that Allenby's cavalry were no longer capable of keeping the Germans at bay, so therefore he had no option but to fight, to deliver a stopping blow. In other words, you know, to thump the Germans really, really hard and then pull away as they're catching their breath. Now, the rivalry between Sir John French and Smith-Dorrien went back many years and was rooted in some very, very trivial things, you know, rivalry within the army. And French, at the time of Le Cateau, basically said Smith-Dorrien did the right thing. But later, he turned very badly against Smith-Dorrien and basically, you know, bad-mouthed and said he nearly destroyed the BEF by fighting Le Cateau and the rest of it. And Smith-Dorrien had been promoted to command Second Army when 2 armies were formed at the end of 1914. So Haig got the First Army, Smith-Dorrien got the Second Army. And during the Second Battle of Ypres, Smith-Dorrien assessed the situation, decided that they needed to withdraw a certain distance, which is absolutely the right thing to do, but French used this as an excuse to sack him. It's basically because French was a bitter rival and, you know, just anything to get rid of it. French Smith-Dorrien's successor was Plumer, did exactly the same thing as Smith-Dorrien had been proposing, and French said, yeah, fine, get on with it. So Smith-Dorrien is sacked basically because of the jealousy of Sir John French. Now, famously, Wally Robertson, who remains the only man to rise from private to field marshal in the course of his career, was French's chief of staff, and he was told to go and break it gently to Smith-Dorrien that he's been relieved. And so the most famous version of it is him going up, and he's always given a Cockney accent. Actually, he was from Lincolnshire, probably spoke like Mrs. Thatcher. Was that Smith-Dorrien was approached by Robertson, who said, "Horace, you're for home." There's another version which just says, "Horace, you've got to hook it." But it's the same thing, dropping of H's, and Wally Robertson kicks him off into obscurity. Smith-Dorrien nearly actually made a comeback because he was appointed to command the Allied forces in East Africa in 1916, but he was ill, and basically he couldn't take up his command. So although he's sacked from the Western Front, had he maintained his health, he could well have actually gone on to do the role basically that Smuts did in East Africa in 1916-17. Yeah.
Having driven around that area around Ypres, Zonderbeek and Passchendaele and what have you, you spend half the time parking the car looking down into the valley to see Ypres 4 or 5 miles away.
Yeah.
And you're left thinking that it may have been the only place they could stop the Germans, but was it the right place that they should stop the Germans? Could you just,
Yeah.
Sue was talking about logistics, every time a wagon came to the front line at Menin or whatever, the Menin gate, the Germans could look from 3 miles away, and so should they have been putting back to somewhere else?
Well, okay. Well, this is roughly this is the shape of the salient as it's left. It's a bit more than that, but it's that broad shape. So basically, you've got the Allies in the middle, and you've got the Germans on 3 sides, and it basically means that if you imagine you've got a sort of a saucer, cut the saucer in half. Ypres in the dip in the middle. That's where the Allies are. The Germans are along the rim. They can look down everywhere onto Ypres itself. And that made the salient, as it became known, the salient. No one had to be asked which salient. The most dangerous place on the Allied front, at least as far as the British are concerned. And there was a good case for saying that the Allies could partially cut their losses. What I mean by that is abandon the salient and pull back much closer to Ypres itself. You can see there's roads, there's a canal, there's a railway. So you need a bit of hinterland to defend it, but actually holding this very, very extended line is not sensible. Problem is that you look at the map and make a sort of rational strategic decision. You also need to take into account the sheer emotional power of the place. Having lost, well, I put up the stats at the beginning, how many people died in the defence of Ypres, and even the end of First Ypres, it's a large number. It's emotionally very, very difficult to abandon it. It's very difficult indeed to explain to the government in Britain and the British population why, having fought bitterly for this place, you then abandon it. The best example of this comes on the 4th of October 1917. It's in what's misleadingly known as Passchendaele, the third battle of Ypres. Plumer's Second Army launches 3 hammer blows, one after the other, 20th, 26th of September and the 4th of October. Each time, basically, hammers the Germans are forced back, do it again, do it again. At the end of the 4th of October, the third of these hammer blows, it starts to rain. Now, when it rains in Belgium, you don't have to know it. And together with the various other problems that you're reaching the end of your supply lines, there's probably it's unlikely you're going to get very much further forward. Okay, fair enough. We say, right, okay, well, we've done pretty well. Bosch or biffing. Let's pull back to Ypres. Because if we stay here, we're at the bottom of a fairly steep incline, the Passchendaele Ridge. The Germans looking down on us. That's not good news. They never even considered doing that. Because the losses in the fighting of 30 up to that point, let alone First Ypres and Second Ypres, was such that they could not possibly justify, in morale terms, simply saying, okay, well, we don't suppose we could, let's pull back and abandon all this territory. Therefore, they had to fight on. So people say, well, why did Haig fight on after the 4th of October when it's obviously weren't getting anywhere fast? Because really, they had two options. You couldn't stay where they are because it was such a terrible position. You couldn't go back because of morale reasons. You had to go forward, and that's the reason. They do eventually, of course, abandon the salient in April 1918 when the Germans launch a massive attack, the Battle of the Lys, and the Ypres salient simply becomes untenable. So they have to abandon and pull back. The amount of heartache involved in the action is incredible. Only the fact that the British Army is in complete crisis across the entire front does the abandonment of Ypres, get covered by everything else. So really, what you're saying makes perfectly good sense in strategic terms. It shattered up against the reality of, could you sell it to the government? Could you sell it to the people? I answer no and no.
Just one more very quick question. Is there someone a little bit more east that they should have stopped 5 miles away?
East of Ypres?
Yeah, or was he really still the last?
Well, it was Roulers, I suppose. The trouble is, by the time they'd been pushed back to Roulers in 1914, they were not really in a position to dig in and make a fight for it. So, in theory, yes, but I think probably in practice, no.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask about the numbers at that church at Shooters Hill?
Yeah.
Were those numbers accurate? Because it strikes me that really vast numbers.
Oh, they're pretty accurate. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't swear that they're.
No.
Yeah. Yes, they're absolutely enormous numbers. But if you think about the losses of the armies of the British Empire in the First World War, about 1 million.
Yeah.
And that's split between the Western Front and the various Ottoman fronts and the Italian front and East Africa. If you look and break down the numbers, a surprisingly large number of them are actually not fighting the Germans. Because apart from anything else, when you're fighting in the East, the medical facilities were much more primitive and there were many more nasty diseases that can kill you. If you're fighting on the Western Front, your chances of being killed or wounded by a bullet or a shell are very high. Your chance of dying of some foul disease is pretty low. At Gallipoli, it's the other way around. So if you then say roughly half of those figures come from the Western Front, you've got the Somme, you've got the fighting in 1915 around Loos, you've got the big 1918 battles, but Ypres is the one long-standing running battle. Even in quiet moments, it's always dangerous. Whereas, if you're on the Somme in 1915 up to about April 1916, it's a quiet front, nothing much happened there. In a salient, it's always dangerous. For the reasons we've already discussed, you're in a trench, the Germans can see you from 3 sides and they can drop stuff on you. Which is basically one of the most remarkable things that General Sir Herbert Plumer, who takes command of Second Army from Smith Dorrien in May 1915, and he becomes in effect GOC, the Ypres salient. He retains this reputation among his men as of being a careful general, someone who's not going to needlessly throw their lives away, in spite of the fact he's commanding the most dangerous part of the entire salient, which says, I think, an awful lot about Plumer's generalship and command. But yeah, I mean, these figures are just enormous. I've been looking a lot at the Second World War recently, and when you look at British battles in the Second World War, the casualties are nothing like the same scale. Usually because the armies are nothing like the same scale. The British Army of the Second World War is much smaller for all sorts of reasons. than the First World War, and the proportion of soldiers actually in harm's way is smaller still. I mean, Saul might remind me, so I can't remember is it about 15% of a slice of a British infantry division 1944 actually holding rifles and bayonets and going into action?
Yeah, exactly.
So 85% aren't, in other words. In the First World War, the vast majority of people in the infantry division are actually soldiers, combat infantrymen. And the two things are not unrelated. When Britain comes to fight the Second World War, nobody, not generals, not politicians, not the British people, are prepared to contemplate those sorts of casualties again. And so they fight the war in a different way. Now, you can argue all that does is basically move these casualties onto a much smaller body of the population, because famously there's about 55,000 air crew killed in Bomber Command, who are exactly the same sort of people who would have been infantry officers in the First World War. And coincidentally, about the same number of infantry officers in the First World War. So actually, in the Second World War, it's more dangerous in some ways to be a frontline soldier, but there are fewer of them, at least in the British case, of actually doing that sort of stuff. So therefore, the British casualties of the Second World War are remarkably light compared to those of the First World War, and particularly compared to those of other armies, Soviets, the Germans. And
Chinese.
those two things are not unrelated. Chinese, Japanese, any number of them. The two things are not unrelated. Yeah.
I was just thinking to myself that, and I might have got this wrong, so Operation Michael, 21st of March 1918, but it wasn't until the 9th of April that Hague, this is to do with the iconic nature of Ypres, the Battle of the Leaves, I think it was the 9th of April, was the backs to the walls.
It's the 11th of April.
And that's a measure of how damned important it was. Of course, there was ground of tactical importance like Mount Kemmel behind, but we were pushed back to Mount Kemmel at that point. But that's not what you were talking about.
No. Well, but you've hit a really important point, because for those who don't know, I've got a map here, never mind, but the German attack, Operation Michael, the huge attack to the south of the 1916 Somme battlefield, 21st of March 1918. The Germans achieved some success, by no means all the success that they want. And one of the reasons for that is that the British Army is at its weakest in the entire Western Front in that sector, because Haig recognises the attack's going to come, he can't be strong everywhere. Where can he afford to give ground? It's in the south. Where can he not afford to give ground? It's in the north around Ypres. Which is why, I mean, he's pretty rattled, must be said, by Operation Michael, the attack towards Saint-Quentin. I mean, he doesn't lose his nerve when it comes to attack around Ypres, but clearly he's much more concerned than he is with the earlier attack. You need to have a glance at a map to see why. You know, you can give away territory in the south and recapture it, because this is what they do. If you lose territory in the Ypres salient, that could well mean the end of the British Army in France.
Following on the question of casualties, really, how do the medical services cope with this? Because they have got no previous experience of taking casualties on and managing casualties on this scale. I know that on the first day of the Somme, one of the biggest problems was that the medical services were just overwhelmed because they had no idea of how many casualties they were going to take. I mean, I imagine the situation must be the same here.
It's patchy, to be honest, because the Royal Army Medical Corps actually is pretty efficient. And the casualties, they are large, but the force is quite small. So actually, it's a large proportion of a smallish force. It's not great, I think it's fair to say, and your treatment really depends on where you are hit. I mean, physically, if you're hit out in no man's land, and then the enemy push back, you might be left there and not recovered. If you're sort of lightly wounded, you can make your way back through the evacuation chain, which is already in place by this stage. The RAMC go into the war with a very well-developed doctrine for casualty evacuation, casualty treatment. They cope just about, although clearly it's a pretty grim experience if you happen to be wounded. As the army gets bigger, which of course it does come in 1915, and you mentioned the Somme, it becomes more and more difficult. But the RAMC also grows in comparable size. So if you get onto the evacuation chain, you have a reasonable chance of surviving. But if you're left stuck out in no man's land, it's probably at the end. And just to make the comparison once again with what's happening in the East, the medical services are truly shocking. Something like, I can't remember whether I actually quoted this or whether I made the quote up myself. But the medical services in the Mesopotamian campaign, for example, much more akin to the Crimean War than what's happening on the Western Front at exactly the same time. Places are just absolutely overwhelmed. The services are absolutely overwhelmed. So again, we have this paradox in the West. Your chances of being killed or wounded by enemy action is really quite high, but actually the medical care is the best it's ever been in the British Army up to this point. And it's never quite overwhelmed.
Are they, I mean, as you said, Ypres is a major communication hub as well, so are they still running trains and things into it? So are casualties evacuated out of the battle area reasonably quickly?
They are. They're using canal barges, among other things. Is the evacuation chain starts with the casualty. I think it's the dressing station is the most advanced post, all the way back to base area hospitals behind the lines, and then back into England. And even at this stage of the war, it's the system's up and running, and it works reasonably effectively. Well, having said that, there's plenty of examples of people evacuated to England. Where do you come from? Birmingham. You get sent to Aberdeen and things like that. But on the whole, your treatment was pretty good. And it's partly, again, someone asked me this earlier about supply. Same way that the British Army medical system is completely overhauled and reformed in the Edwardian period. It's a much more efficient army in 1914 in all sorts of ways than it had been in 1899. And in comparison to some of the other armies, the Russian, for example, it's almost miraculously brilliant.
Okay, we'll take a break there. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.